Welcome to episode 9 of Modern Monarch. I am your host, Eddie Mead, aka Elmer. Everything here you hear that is not a quote from something is my opinion. I am an independent musician, songwriter, parapolitics researcher, esoterica enthusiast, and Montauk boy. This podcast will mainly cover such topics as mind control, ritual abuse, mental illness, substance abuse and addiction, music, sus Wisconsin, and more, viewed through a lens of dialectical materialism. I will maintain a balanced approach of presenting grounded research based on extensive reading and people's personal experiences. It will especially focus on a specific investigation of mine into decades-long countrywide conspiracies. As I explain, you will come to know why I began this podcast in the first place. So we just got done with an in-depth look at the Dozier School for Boys, the experimentation, abuses, and deaths that occurred there during its existence. There were Nazi doctors who may have been brought to the U.S. as a part of Operation Paperclip, and others with possible intelligence community connections. It took us in many directions, including MKUltra, residential schools where Nazi doctors also appeared, and labor camps. Most of those topics are what we will now be covering much further, but the people and places are all new to this podcast. Actually, in episode 6, I did very briefly mention the first subject of today's show, which is the Dora concentration camp in World War II. These episodes will include readings from Gravity's Rainbow by my friends Frankie and Gina from the wonderful podcast Screaming Reverberations. The excerpts will help add context and allow us to expand our exploration of the show's subjects. Pynchon's first appearance in our story was when we began looking into the sus American International College and Curtis Blake Learning Services in Massachusetts. I brought up his ancestor who wrote the first banned book in the Americas. I am currently working on the first premium episode of this podcast for Patreon members, and it has a lot to do with the Runsdorfs, and it gets back to the counterfeit drug stuff that we started the podcast with. It's going to be really incredible, and I would like to say here that I've been having a really hard time lately, and I'm trying to find a job, and while doing that, I'm trying to research as hard as I can as well, and I've been getting a lot of threats as I get closer to certain topics. Just the other day, something showed up on my back porch that I shouldn't talk about. Possibly a bullet casing. I just want to, I don't know. It was after I had recently had a dream of being shot by someone with a shotgun. I've been targeted for a long time and gang stalked to an extent. Some of the things that I cover on, here's how I'll say it. I think that some of the things that I'm going to cover on the Patreon feed deal with more touchy subjects like that, and also there's going to be a lot of good deep research in there. It's just going to talk about some of this shit needs to be behind a wall. Some privacy, a paywall, I guess, because of the places of power these people are in, and yeah. So that first premium episode is going to go into, it'll be partially a Running with the Runsdorfs Part 2 episode. It will be part targeted individual and gang stalking stuff. Probably it will be part having fun whatever there is left of it in the world. I think I'm gonna try to introduce a new song, so it should be good stuff. We're gonna get into more counterfeit stuff, more APAC and Israel related stuff, and the diamond business and distant family mysterious deaths. It's going to be a real vaudeville show. I say that because I think there's a vaudeville show that is mentioned in it. I have a couple premium episodes lined up. I'm really trying to make it work in this capitalist system, researching and looking for jobs at the same time, and I'm already being targeted, and it's making the job hunt harder than I thought it would be. And I understand if you don't believe me. It's a tough world out there. Trying to deal with that and the memories kind of thing, the Montauk memories kind of thing, that's definitely going to be behind a paywall. Changed my mind about this stuff because I don't know, I'm really struggling. Really struggling to make sense of everything and where I lie in this whole timeline. And I'm still such a skeptic. I think you will find my Montauk research really grounded. We're gonna talk a lot about Project Stargate, and I'm not going to try to convince you that time travel and super soldiers and all this crazy alien stuff is real, because that's not my thing either. I'm a skeptic. But there's some really horrible human trafficking stuff going on, and Montauk was involved. And I have thought about taking the Montauk boy part of the intro out, because I don't know if I've been there in Montauk itself, but if there is a Project Montauk, or what we talk about as Project Montauk, there has been a continuation of that kind of thing, and it happened. We'll get into it. Okay. Anyways, don't worry, because this is not going to become a Patreon-only thing. I just need to think about who gets to hear what I have to say about certain things, I guess. That probably makes no sense. Anyways, also don't worry. Although we are going to be using Pynchon's writings to help us examine multiple people, events, and ideologies in the future, this is not going to become a Pynchon podcast either, as I'm not an expert on his work, just a big fan. I will leave that to Frankie, Gina, and other shows that do a fantastic job studying him, such as Parapower Mapping and Death is Just Around the Corner. Before we move on, I will bring up how I found out after releasing the episodes that Ewan Cameron would use Thorazine in his cocktail of drugs, much like it is said by Dozier survivors that Thorazine was probably part of the Sousa soup. And Ewan Cameron's co-worker Donald Hebb at McGill University, who we've talked about, I also learned a bit more about him. So I would like to... They keep coming up at the beginning of episodes, so let's talk about them a little bit more. I just gotta go through my phone really quick to find... So we talked about Donald Hebb because Brian Cleary from the Curtis Blake schools came from McGill as well and possibly worked under Hebb and Cameron, and that will get us into Freemasons and groups within the Freemasons like the Jesters and the Shriners. Program to Chill did some excellent work about that, and if anything, I will kind of be trying to expand on that. But Robert Scavarla on Twitter, wonderful source, you should follow him, found something from the book Brainwash by Dominic Streetfield. It is about Donald Hebb's CIA-funded sensory deprivation experiments. Quote, Hebb then tried a new tack. If subjects would choose to listen to meaningless and repetitive tapes rather than silence, would they choose to accept propaganda? He replaced Home on the Range with a series of lectures aimed at persuading the listener of the reality of various paranormal phenomena. When asked before they entered the chambers, the volunteers denied believing in the supernatural. By the time they came out, however, their views had changed. Some subjects later admitted to visiting the local library after the experiment to read up further on extrasensory perception. A handful reported a newly discovered fear of ghosts. When Hebb had faced the Defense Research Board in June 1951, he had said that the goal of his experiments was to determine whether isolation and white noise might facilitate the implanting of new beliefs. The answer, it seemed, was yes. End quote. So that CIA-funded research that we've been talking about, the psychic driving kind of stuff that you and Cameron did, that's where Sousa comes into things with his own sound therapy, using tapes and stuff like that. It's incredible that this stuff works, and it makes you think about people were so isolated and stuck inside back in like 2020, for example, during COVID, and conspiracies really ramped up back around then. It was the perfect time for psyops because everybody was so alone and just consuming media in an unhealthy way. And I don't know, I've been trying to deal with some people who have beliefs about paranormal stuff that I think is CIA bullshit. Gosh, I really got this show off to start in an emotional whirlwind, wrong direction, and that's okay because I have a transcript here to read from. This is why I don't go off script sometimes, because it's a script I've written myself. I've spent a long time on it, but nobody wants to listen to me talk about what I think. Gosh, I don't know. Anyways, I'm reconsidering this entire everything. Anyways, maybe it will surprise you, but the Dora concentration camp will lead us all the way to America's most beloved and famous entertainment company, Disney. I look forward to taking you on that adventure. We will begin the episode with a short excerpt from a book by a survivor of the Mittelbau Dora camp, which we will be reading more from throughout. The survivor and author is Jean Michel, and the title is Dora, the Nazi concentration camp where modern space technology was born and 30,000 prisoners died. He was a member of the French resistance that was captured and sent to the camp. Now, from the introduction, Quote, "My book is not only about deportation. Dora, with its romantic, feminine name, was never a camp like the others. A Nazi war criminal was to call it, quote within quote, the hell of all the concentration camps, end quote within quote. That is not the whole story. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Buchenwald, Dachau, any of the men responsible for these infernos who escaped punishment will be damned for eternity. Dora is different. Men who were intimately involved with the creation and operation of the camp are today respected, venerated, and admired. There has been a huge conspiracy to ensure that those two shameful syllables do not stain the cult of these new idols of modern times. They executed the monsters who, whip in hand, made us toil night and day. They hung the Nazi leaders who dared, in the middle of the 20th century, to turn men into slaves and re-establish hell on earth. But they have drawn a veil over the indisputable and atrocious fact that this slavery, this unspeakable sum of suffering, misery, and death was put, at Dora, to the service of the manufacture of missiles, which may not have enabled Hitler to win the war, but which later, after the Russians and the Americans had shamelessly scooped up the scientists of the Reich, a Reich promised for 1,000 years, made possible the conquest of space. The missiles were the pyramids of Hitler's Germany. Just as the tourist in his espadrilles and gaily colored shirt gazes in wonder at the Sphinx, so the visitor to NASA, or National Aeronautics and Space Administration, can today admire, quote within quote, set up in a row before the Space Museum like fantastic arrows pointed at the stars, a display of hardware developed by von Braun and his team. At the beginning of one row, resurrected out of a junkyard, stands the grandfather of all the big rockets used today, both in the United States and the Soviet Union. It is a V2, end quote within quote, which is from James McGovern's Crossbow and Overcast, page 238, end quote. Just to differentiate, the James McGovern who wrote Crossbow and Overcast is not the same one as current Massachusetts Congressman Jim McGovern. The one who wrote the book was an American intelligence agent in post-war Germany. A lot of the source material he used was classified secret until shortly before his book's publication in 1964. Regarding the title, Crossbow was the Allied operation that discovered and used countermeasures against the Nazi rocket program, while Overcast was the original codename for Operation Paperclip, which was the effort to bring thousands of Nazis to America before the Soviets could get to them. Actually, it's more complicated than that, so we should read some more from Crossbow and Overcast. Quote, Chapter 8, Blacklist. 6 weeks before von Braun's birthday party in central Germany, Robert Staver, a 28-year-old major in U.S. Army Ordnance, had arrived in London. As Staver was reporting to his commanding officer, Major Calvin Corey, in an office building at 27 Grosvenor Square, both men were shaken and thrown to the floor by a terrific blast. Staver got up, looked out the window, and, as he remembers it, saw, quote within quote, a big round cloud of smoke where a V2 had exploded overhead, end quote within quote. As hot metal rained down on Grosvenor Square, Staver calculated that the missile had been heading, quote within quote, very directly at us, end quote within quote, but had exploded prematurely in the air. This was not Staver's last encounter with V2 at close hand. He was billeted in a hotel near the Marble Arch, and one evening was thrown out of bed by another terrific blast, which he recalls, quote within quote, made the drapes of my windows stand straight out from the wall, end quote within quote. A V-2 had landed in Hyde Park just beyond the Marble Arch, killing 62 soapbox orators and their listeners. And when Staver was driving on ordnance business to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough with Ed Hull, an American civil engineer, a V-2 scored a chance direct hit on a roadside Packard warehouse, half a mile ahead of them. Staver and Hull stopped to examine the crater and the damage. Hundreds of new Rolls-Merlin aircraft engines in the warehouse had been demolished and 15 workers killed. Staver had good reason to take careful note of the effect of the V-2s. He had been sent to Europe by Army Ordnance to investigate those blacklist targets having to do with German rockets and guided missiles. He was part of what would become a vast hunt for the secrets of German science, launched by all of the Allies as the war drew to a close. The hunt was spurred by a fact that was obvious to the technical experts. The Germans had failed in the key field of atomic research, but they had succeeded in developing many new devices that were much more advanced than anything the Allies possessed. End quote. Really quick, I was going to add to this episode some stuff about Nazi weapons, and I've done some reading on some alleged Nazi weapons, and I think it might be another good premium episode is going into some of the things that, as mentioned there, although the Nazis failed at building an atomic bomb, they built a bunch of weapons that were very impressive to the Allied forces. Some of them resemble flying saucers, some of them... we're gonna have to get into it. I can't wait to get done recording all of this so I can start recording that. Anyways, more from Crossbow and Overcast. Quote, the electric-powered U-boat, the jet plane, and the long-range rocket were only the most spectacular in a long list of prizes that awaited the enterprising victor. End quote. See what I'm talking about? Quote, the German failure to develop an atom bomb was discovered by the Allies through the efforts of Alsos, the first large-scale scientific intelligence mission in history, whose objectives took precedence over every other German target, including V-2. When the very real fears that the Germans might have developed an atom bomb proved to be groundless, scientific intelligence turned to other targets. V-2 was one, but only one, of the prizes sought by technical intelligence units organized by the various branches of the American armed forces. A misconception has persisted since World War II that this massive search was a coordinated effort called Operation Paperclip. In the spring of 1945, when it began, the venture had no name. Units representing the Army, Army Air Forces, and Navy simply went to Germany to find out what they could, frequently competing with each other as well as with their British and Russian counterparts. It was not until July 1945 that this freewheeling overall operation was formalized under the secret codename Overcast. Of all the American agencies that would become involved in Overcast, one agency and one man had from the beginning displayed the greatest interest in V-2. In September 1943, Colonel Gervais William Trickle of Trickle, Louisiana, a 1918 graduate of West Point with a Master of Science degree from MIT and a doctorate in electrical engineering from the University of California, had been appointed to a newly created post in Army Ordnance, Chief Rocket Branch. After the first V-2s had been put into action in September 1944, Colonel Trickle received reports on their performance from Europe, which made him realize that the United States, like England and Russia, was at least 20 years behind the Germans in rocket development. End quote. I'm going to need to stop here really quick. I'm realizing through all of this ordnance stuff, people who have followed me for a while might know that my great uncle was present at the firing of the atomic cannon in Nevada in the 1950s, and he was an ordnance person. And that's another thing that is going to come up in the premium stuff is some family history, and it's gonna lead to a bunch of very cool things to talk about. Anyways, quote, as Germany's defeat became a certainty, Trickle saw an opportunity. If intact V-2s, their technical data and blueprints, and interrogations of the men who had developed the world's first long-range rocket could be placed at his disposal, his small Army Ordnance rocket branch would be able to pick up where the Germans had left off. Millions of dollars and 20 years of research and development time would be saved. Colonel Trickle acted to capitalize on the opportunity in two ways. In late 1944, he had negotiated a contract with the General Electric Company for Project Hermes, in which General Electric was to research and develop long-range guided missiles for Army Ordnance. Ordnance established a test firing range at the White Sands Proving Ground in the New Mexico desert, and Trickle felt that it would be a great help to the Project Hermes engineers to study and fire some of the live V-2s there. In March 1945, he sent a request to Colonel Holger Toftoy, Chief of Ordnance Technical Intelligence in Paris, who was responsible for capturing new German operational weapons and shipping them back to the States for study. Trickle urged Toftoy to find 100 V-2s in good operational condition and to ship them to New Mexico. To direct the location and interrogation of the German guided missile specialists in the securing of the V-2 documents for the United States, Colonel Trickle had already sent Major Robert Staver to London in February. Staver had graduated from Stanford, in 1940 with a mechanical engineering degree and had 3 years of experience in Army Ordnance rocket development. He reported for duty as Chief, Rocket Section, Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee, Liaison Branch of the Technical Division, Office of the Chief Ordnance Officer. This jaw-breaking designation, while formidable enough, was not as formidable as the job that confronted Staver. End quote. And it goes on to say that he had to compile lists of all the installations where the Germans were working on jet propulsion and guided missiles. And then he had to create lists of the thousands of technicians. And then he had to grade them all in importance. And 2 months later, he had those lists ready. The British gave him most of that. And it's funny because the British would definitely end up last in the race for all of this stuff between the Russians and the Americans and themselves. So it's pretty funny that they fucked up by giving all this information away. The most informative thing was the Ausenberg list. Ausenberg was a professor of mechanical engineering at the University of Hanover, He was a Nazi and a member of the SS, and Goering placed him in charge of the planning office of the Reich's Research Council. He compiled a complete index of all scientific projects during the war and the engineers and scientists assigned to them. And this was a list of around 15,000 people. And he had the Gestapo check on their loyalty and note everything down to their little personal idiosyncrasies, like, quote, alcoholism, wife beating, collection of pornography, homosexuality, keeping a mistress, having given pre-war lectures in the United States or England, end quote. So that gave a lot of help to U.S. military intelligence figuring out who to look for. Anyways, I'm going to continue. I'll point out, which Frank pointed out to me actually, that Crossbow and Overcast was probably a textual source for Gravity's Rainbow that Pynchon used. And it's going to help us learn a bit about Operation Crossbow, begun by the British. But keep in mind that this was written by an American intelligence agent, and it looks to me to be a limited hangout. Anyways, the Brits had good reason to fear advanced German rocketry during the war. However, until 1943, they did not have much knowledge of the Nazi war machine's ability to produce such rockets that could reach them. Since the Allies were mostly working on smaller, limited-range ones, maybe they didn't believe the Germans were capable of something more. Rumors and reports of strange new weapons were beginning to surface, though, so the British Chiefs of Staff recommended to Churchill that someone be put in charge of investigating this. That someone was Churchill's son-in-law, Duncan Sandys. He was an MP in the Conservative Party, as well as the financial secretary to the War Office at the time, another job given to him by his father-in-law. When he is first introduced in the book, a footnote is included stating that at the time of the book's publication, Sandys was Secretary for Colonial and Commonwealth Affairs. I guess his career had continued to prosper, and he ended up with responsibility for what remained of Britain's colonial empire. Sandys began looking through the intelligence that had been collected. There were the Oslo letters from 1939, detailed reports of secret German experimental long-range rockets on an island off the Baltic coast, sent anonymously by some sort of high-level German government official. Back when they were received, nothing came of them. They were just filed away for later. There were also reconnaissance photos from 1942 of a new airfield at the tiny fishing village of Peenemünde, which is on the Baltic Sea island of Usedom. The airfield was surrounded by oddly shaped buildings. At the time, much like the Oslo letters, the photos were also just filed away. Intelligence reports had been arriving from Denmark, Poland, Sweden, and Norway. Reading from Crossbow and Overcast now, quote, Danish intelligence, for example, reported that fishermen had seen strange objects with, quote-unquote, flaming tails, end quote-unquote, streaking across the night sky as they fished off the Danish island of Bornholm. The objects seemed to come from Peenemünde on the nearby German island of Usedom. More solid news came from Polish Home Army intelligence, which reported that Germans had definitely constructed a unique research installation at Peenemünde. Polish slave laborers had been recruited for work there and were housed at Trossenheide, a settlement for foreign workers on Usedom Island. In fact, 2 members of the Polish underground with technical training had chanced to be among those Poles sent to Trossenheide by the Germans. They had been permitted to enter the heavily guarded secret part of the installation on a brief tour of latrine duty. One of them had passed a shed with its door ajar. Inside he spotted a torpedo-shaped object with wings. It looked like a midget airplane, and yet it had no cockpit or any other space for a pilot. This news and a crude layout of the Peenemünde installation were duly passed on to London by the Polish underground. All the available evidence about a new secret weapon pointed to Peenemünde, Sandys thought. End quote. He ordered more aerial photography of the island and monitoring of German radio, on which there was bragging of new miracle weapons that would win the war. Some of those so-called miracle weapons we will talk about in that premium episode I brought up earlier. Sandys also had the intelligence services interview refugee scientists and interrogate prisoners of war. Here's more from the book, skipping some paragraphs. Quote, a captured German general, one of the thousands of prisoners of war who were being interrogated in the search for the facts, admitted that he had seen big rockets. He had not been overly impressed by them, but he had heard talk that they were designed to win the war for Germany. A second captured general confirmed what the first had said. Neither could provide details, and Sandys went back to the Secret Intelligence Service. The answer was as frustrating as before. Peenemünde could not be penetrated, and intelligence's most highly placed contacts in the German government could provide no further information. Whatever was going on at Peenemünde was obviously a secret shared by those working there and a handful of the highest Nazi leaders. If the secret weapons he had been asked to investigate were indeed big rockets, to Sandys this meant trouble of the most serious kind. For, although it had no part in his investigation, another problem existed which was causing acute anxiety within the inner circle of Allied leaders, one which the general public was also unaware of. The atomic bomb project had gotten underway in earnest in the United States in the summer of 1942, but the insiders knew that 2 Germans, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, had been the first to discover the principle of uranium fission upon which the atom bomb would be based. This had happened in December 1938. It was not known what the Germans had done with their head start, although it was known that they were conducting research in atomic energy. The thought of what could happen if Hitler got his hands on a long-range rocket or pilotless aircraft was unnerving in itself, but the thought of what could happen if they were equipped with atomic devices in their warheads struck Sandys as the most frightening possibility of the entire war. He sat down and once again carefully reviewed the patchwork of available evidence, meager, confusing, but still alarming, and then presented his report to the War Cabinet, whose members came upon this sobering paragraph, quote within quote, it would appear that the Germans have for some time past been trying to develop a heavy rocket capable of bombarding an area from a very long range. This work has probably been proceeding side by side with the development of jet-propelled aircraft and airborne rocket torpedoes. Very little information is available about the progress of this development. However, such scanty evidence as exists suggests that it may be far advanced. London, in view of its size, is much the most likely target. End quote within quote. London was the most likely target. Given the limited accuracy at long range of the early rockets and quote within quote airborne rocket torpedoes, end quote within quote, They could not be used effectively against specific military targets. They would have to be fired at random against large, crowded cities. The War Cabinet agreed with Sandys that the threat to London was serious but could not agree on countermeasures. Photographic espionage was intensified and soon revealed, popping up like measles all over the face of northern France, quote-unquote, work of an unexplained nature, end quote-unquote. It was surmised that these puzzling structures, all pointing toward London, might be firing points for the secret weapons, but the secret of the exact nature of these weapons still remained to be solved satisfactorily. The photographs definitely confirmed that experimental work was being done on 3 different kinds of unusual weapons, but could give no indication of how and when they would be put into action, or in what order. These questions caused anxious, spirited debate among the Prime Minister's scientific advisors. The majority opinion, however, came round to Sandys' persistent advocacy of the view that London was in for a novel kind of attack from the air. Herbert Morrison, Minister for Home Security, considered the prospect of having to undertake a wholesale evacuation of metropolitan London. Something had to be done, and quickly. On June 29th, Winston Churchill, following the recommendation of his Defense Committee, settled the matter of what should be done. Peenemünde would be attacked by Bomber Command at the first favorable opportunity. This would be a British operation. The Americans, for the present, would not be fully informed of the concern that the Sandys investigation had caused. A single, massive, and dangerous strike by moonlight was called for. Its primary purpose was to kill the scientists and engineers who, it was reasoned, would be asleep and unprotected within the Peenemünde installation. End quote. And now, having been introduced to Duncan Sandys, we will hear from Frankie and Gina from Screaming Reverberations for the first time, reading from Gravity's Rainbow, because Duncan Sandys comes up in that. And this part that they are reading also includes one of the most famous passages in the book, the 3rd proverb for paranoids, which we will briefly discuss after.
Slothrop swings the long keychain of his zoot in some agitation. A few things are immediately obvious. There is even more being zeroed in on him from out there than he thought, even in his most paranoid spells.
Imipolex G shows up on a mysterious installation device on a rocket being fired with the help of a transmitter on the roof of the headquarters of Dutch Shell, who is co-licensee for marketing for the Imipolex, a rocket whose propulsion system bears an uncanny resemblance to one developed by British Shell at around the same time.
And oh boy, it just occurred to Slothrop now where all the rocket intelligence is being gathered. Into the office of who but Mr. Duncan Sandys, Churchill's own son-in-law, who works out of the Ministry of Supply located where but at Shell Mech's house, for Christ's sake.
Here, Slothrop stages a brilliant commando raid, along with faithful companion Blodgett Waxwing, on Shell Mech's house itself, right into the heart of the rocket's own branch office in London, mowing down platoons of heavy security with his little Sten, kicking aside nubile and screaming WRAC secretaries. How else is there to react, even in play?
Savagely looting files, throwing Molotov cocktails, the Zoot Suit Zanies at last crashing into the final sanctum with their trousers up around their armpits, smelling of singed hair, spilled blood, to find not Mr. Duncan Sandys cowering before their righteousness, nor open window, gypsy flight, scattered fortune cards,
Nor even a test of wills with the great consortium itself, but only a rather dull room, business machines arrayed around the walls calmly blinking, files of cards pierced frail as sugar faces, frail as the last German wall standing without support after the bombs have been, and now twisting high above, threatening to fall down out of the sky from the force of the wind that has blown the smoke away.
The smell of firearms is in the air, and there's not an office dame in sight. The machines chatter and ring to each other. It's time to snap down your brims, share a post-violence cigarette, and think about escape. Do you remember the way in? All the twists and turns?
No, you weren't looking. Any of these doors might open you to safety, but there may not be time. But Duncan Sandys is only a name, a function in this. How high does it go? Is not even the right kind of question to be asking, because the organization charts have all been set up by them, the titles and names filled in by them.
Because Proverbs for Paranoids number 3. If they can get you asking the wrong questions, they don't have to worry about answers. Now, that passage from Gravity's Rainbow kind of centered around Slothrop's suspicion that Duncan Sandys is working into this sort of grander scheme against him, and not just against him, but against the human race in general. And if you've not read Gravity's Rainbow, then you don't really have to worry about the grander details of that conspiracy, other than to know that it is a very grand conspiracy, and it involves the V2 rocket very heavily. You know, if you've not read Gravity's Rainbow, or if you don't know very much about it, it is sort of the grand novel of rocketry, I would say. Not just the V2, but rocketry in general. Because its interests also sort of expand out even further into what the V2 was later used for, which was, of course, NASA's mission to the moon. But anyway, to get into Duncan Sandys, besides the inherent interest in him as the head of Britain's rocket intelligence program, not to mention being Churchill's son-in-law, some other facts about Duncan Sandys bear mentioning. So, as befits the son-in-law of a British prime minister, Sandys was raised in an atmosphere of extreme wealth and influence. His father had been a second lieutenant in the British Army during the Boer War and the First World War, later serving as a Conservative Member of Parliament himself. His parents later got divorced. His mother at that point got married to a highly influential diplomat who'd spent the fin de siècle in places like Vienna and Paris. And after Duncan Sandys himself gets out of Eton, he enters the diplomatic foreign service like his stepfather. And he spends the years immediately before World War II posted to the German embassy in Berlin. So Sandys was a prominent member of the Anglo-German Fellowship, a kind of British fascist appeasement group formed in close collaboration with Nazis like Joachim von Ribbentrop. The AGF was primarily interested in the realization of a powerful German Reich that could serve as kind of a European peacekeeping force that was going to free up the English to pursue what was left of their empire. Some of the fellow members of the Anglo-German Fellowship included both the governor and director of the Bank of England and the chief editor of the Times. In the years after the war, when Sandys was elected as a Conservative Member of Parliament like his father, one of his primary pursuits was gutting the RAF's bomber wing in favor of a robust program of long and short-range missile systems. This would later be revoked by other British politicians, but this would result in the immediate bankruptcy of several British aero defense firms. Sandys' probably most lasting influence would be his push towards very early forms of the European Union, which is an extremely weird statement in light of the Anglo-German Fellowship's desire for a German-policed continent. Sandys organized the launch of the United Europe movement in 1947, which would soon kind of gather all these other allies and snowball into the International Committee of the Movements for European Unity. It's a fucking mouthful. Duncan Sandys co-chaired that along with the exiled Polish power broker Józef Rettinger, who, with backing from both the U.S. intelligence community and all kinds of shadowy European fascist types, Rettinger, would go on to be one of the architects and founders of the Bilderberg Group. The ICMEU held the Congress of Europe in The Hague in 1948, which is considered a key step in the development of the EU. Sandy's grandson Hugo Dixon is currently advising the EU on matters related to the dispensation of Russian funds that have been frozen in the aftermath of, all of these worldwide sanctions that have been placed on Russia. So his grandson's trying to figure out what to do with all this frozen Russian money. Duncan Sandys would divorce Diana Churchill in 1960 and spend much of his later career involved in the British gold mining industry, specifically through the Lonhro Company, which is now the Lonmin Company, and that stands for the London and Rhodesian Mining and Land Company Limited. These dealings would bring him in close collaboration with many Rhodesians, and he was a very ardent supporter of Rhodesia's 1967 Independence Declaration.
That proverb for paranoids: if they can get you asking the wrong questions, they don't have to worry about the answers, is so good. And it reminds me of a lot of the UFO disclosure bullshit that has been happening recently, and it reminds me of what I was speaking of earlier when I brought up Montauk. Montauk is used as this one giant conspiracy theory that has everything, like otherworldly wars between aliens and humans and alternate timelines, and it's not the point. But if it becomes the point, then everybody will be distracted and they won't focus on very real things that happened, mind control experiments and the torture of children and trafficking of children. And I'm just gonna keep going because that stuff will come up in the premium episodes. The excerpts from Crossbow and Overcast that we have read, most of them were from chapter 1, and then we read quite a bit of chapter 8 as well. The second chapter describes the bombing raid of the Peenemünde installation and introduces two incredibly important people. The first being Major General Walter Dornberger, who is in charge of rocket development for the German army. The other person can probably be considered the main character of this episode, Dornberger's engineering director, Wernher von Braun. We will be discussing his life, and Gravity's Rainbow even opens with a sarcastic quote from von Braun. Quote, "Nature does not know extinction. All it knows is transformation. Everything science has taught me and continues to teach me strengthens my belief in the continuity of our spiritual existence after death." End quote. Anyway, recall what we read at the beginning from the book by a Dora concentration camp survivor, specifically the sentence, quote, "Men who were intimately involved with the creation and operation of the camp are today respected, venerated, and admired," end quote. Out of any of those men, von Braun is by far the most well-known and heralded as an American hero. However, he also holds a lot of responsibility for the 20,000 to 30,000 deaths that occurred at Dora. His name is the title of an entire chapter in that book, which we will definitely be reading from. Walter Dornberger and Wernher von Braun both survived the bombing by the British, as did many of the other Nazis there at Peenemünde. Tragically, the Polish slave laborers and Russian POWs kept nearby did not. Their death estimates range from 500 to over 700. From Crossbow and Overcast again, quote, "The Russian POWs and the Polish laborers in the Trossenheide camp could not flee. Direct hits shattered and set their wooden huts on fire, forcing panic-stricken men. Scores of them turned into torches by the hissing incendiaries, to claw at the barbed wire enclosures. As they tried to crawl through the wire, the SS guards waved them back and, when they did not obey, set Doberman pinchers on them or used machine guns. None of the foreign workers escaped during the confusion of the raid to bring any further information about Peenemünde to British intelligence, and the reports from the 2 technically trained members of the Polish underground stopped after this night." End quote. Although there was a large loss of life, ultimately the damage dealt to infrastructure by the British bombs was not too terrible, according to both books we have excerpted so far. First, continuing from Crossbow and Overcast, quote, "On a sunlit Saturday morning, August 21st, 1943, a mass funeral service was held at Peenemünde, presided over by a Lutheran minister and a Catholic priest. 735 charred corpses were interred in common graves hastily dug along the wrecked railroad tracks. But Dornberger noted that the majority of those killed were Russian POWs and Polish laborers from Trossenheide. 178 German technicians had been lost. Of these, Dr. Walter Thiel alone, with his unique knowledge of rocket engines, would be difficult to replace. Dornberger, however, did not underestimate the meaning of the raid. The British could not know exactly what was going on at Peenemünde, but they had learned enough to be willing to pay a brutally high price to destroy it. They had failed, but the bombers would return unless extensive changes were made. There would be no attempt, henceforth, to manufacture rockets at Peenemünde. This would be transferred to the Harz Mountains of central Germany. The supersonic wind tunnel would be transferred to Kochel in the Bavarian Alps. Test firings and the training of army firing crews would be carried out in southern Poland, beyond the range of heavy bombers. Some necessary testing and all development work would continue at Peenemünde, but the settlement would be abandoned and the technicians dispersed over other parts of Usedom Island. Repairs would be made to essential buildings only. Activity would be kept inside during the day when the reconnaissance planes appeared, and camouflage would be put up. Everything possible would be done to create the illusion that Peenemünde had been destroyed." End quote. Frankie noted to me that Gravity's Rainbow mentions Thiel's death and those British bombing raids several times. He has postulated a connection between Walter Thiel and Peter Thiel. Neither of us has been able to confirm that at all, and Thiel is a pretty common name. But I think it is worth reading this article from flyingpenguin.com. Quote, "Peter Thiel represents the hidden genealogy of American fascism. Peter Thiel's extremist anti-democratic politics make perfect sense when you understand he was literally raised by a father repeatedly fleeing the prospect of democratic rule, seeking sanctuary among American white supremacists who offered a future of racial exclusion through different mechanisms. His father Klaus, born in Germany in 1938, formative childhood years under Nazi rule, trained as a chemical engineer and married before immigrating to the United States in 1968 with their one-year-old son Peter, born October 11, 1967 in Frankfurt. Klaus strategically pulled Peter away from Germany just as the student movement was forcing Germans to seriously confront their Nazi past. Klaus apparently moved away to actively prevent his son from receiving the kind of historical education that would prevent ideological transmission. A pattern then emerges. Klaus fled Nazi Germany to hide in the heavily Nazi-influenced territory of southern Africa. That is to say, after Germany in 1967 was under pressure to end transmission of Nazism to Peter, Klaus relocates the family to an overtly racist enclave. They remained there only until eventually it too came under pressure to end transmission of Nazism as majority rule approached in 1977. Klaus moved his family next to the epicenter of America's emerging hard-right movement. In California, the Thiel family found comfort among American extremists who shared their worldview about anti-democracy, racial hierarchy, and property rights over civil rights. It's hard to say economic migration was ever at hand for the Thiel family, given such clear signs of ideological refuge-seeking by Klaus, trying to avoid admitting who lost World War II. Klaus twice left the place where Heil Hitler was normal conversation, a notable life choice. First, they left Nazi Germany, and then they left Nazi Namibia, finally settling when they found Nazism could run unchecked within infamous American white flight suburbs. The eve of Namibia granting political representation to non-whites is unmistakably why Klaus abruptly fled a Nazi enclave in Africa to a particularly racist area of Northern California. There he found an extremist anti-tax, anti-government revolt was mobilizing as a form of conservatism. Reagan's racist revolution was crystallizing. Klaus chose the notorious San Mateo, racist redline county development called Foster City at the absolute highest peak of racist master plan areas protesting American desegregation. A young Afrikaner working for Klaus in 1976 put it like this, perhaps best revealing the Thiel family's sentiment as they traded their Swakopmund compound for the red lines of Foster City, California. Quote unquote, Heil Hitler, said the black gas station attendant matter-of-factly to the department customer, raising his right arm to the traditional height. He offered the outdated salute after a pleasant conversation in which he explained the fluency of his German. It appeared not to be a joke, but rather a greeting that he had exchanged before with German customers. A hitchhiker, a 23-year-old Afrikaner, teaching woodworking at a uranium mine near here, thought he was typical of his generation, he said, more modern than that of his parents. If majority rule comes, he said, they will probably cross the border with many others. End quote, unquote. As project manager for construction of Namibia's Rossing uranium mine in the mid-1970s, Klaus had inserted himself into South Africa's overtly illegal nuclear supply chain during the height of apartheid. South Africa occupied Namibia while rejecting UN Security Council Resolution 435. His illegal project supplied uranium for multiple national nuclear programs and operated despite international criticism of working conditions and racial segregation. The Thiel family selected notoriously Nazified and internationally condemned Swakopmund during the mine's construction phase, where Peter was intentionally placed into German language schools. In other words, Klaus skips out of Germany on the eve of denazification, headed to America, but then he bounces out of prosperous 1970s America to work in an overtly illegal apartheid South African nuclear weapons proliferation project during the height of international sanctions. One unverified claim suggests Klaus's American colleagues even called him the Gestapo, though the source and context of this characterization remain unclear. More significantly, Claus's decision to leave the occupation and reconstruction of Germany to oversee South Africa's weapons material development in Swakopmund under the apartheid system during the 1970s, when international sanctions and moral opposition were intensifying, reveal a preference for racist authoritarianism. Perhaps that explains Claus's hard line on always remaining a German citizen and speaking German at home for 51 years, while never living in Germany, instead claiming to have his home in America while working abroad. This decision was highly unusual. While his wife Suzanne became a naturalized U.S. citizen, Claus maintained his German passport throughout his entire American residence until his death. Claus maintaining German citizenship like this for 5 decades was genuinely aberrant behavior for his generation, and yet there appears to be no evidence of naturalization applications, rejections, or legal barriers that would explain this choice. INS and USCIS records from Claus's era, 1968 to the 1970s, are held in National Archives C-files, but no evidence emerged of any citizenship proceedings. This suggests Claus' rejection of American citizenship to stay German, while also fleeing Germany to prevent Peter from denazification, was entirely voluntary for his entire life rather than circumstantial. The timing, choices, and context create a genuinely suspicious pattern that deserves serious scrutiny rather than dismissal. On top of that, when Peter proudly entered Stanford, he bragged to at least 2 classmates that apartheid works and was economically sound. He clearly was referring to his father's work in apartheid-era Namibia, specifically to construct uranium mining infrastructure for South Africa's clandestine nuclear weapons program, in an operation where black migrant workers were, quote unquote, dying like flies, end quote unquote, from radiation exposure, while white managers like Claus enjoyed country club privileges with his son Peter. Claus's documented toxic career represents exactly the kind of German technical expertise that found ideological comfort in systems of racial domination and nuclear intimidation. Peter's current politics are apparently the result of his father's efforts to preserve Nazi beliefs through migration to South Africa, occupied Namibia, and America. End quote. There's a little more to the article, but you get the point. I almost forgot that he went to Stanford. Oh, and by the way, I realized I made a funny ooh earlier when Stanford came up in reading Crossbow and Overcast. That's because Stanford is going to come up again and again as the show goes on, especially in the second, or maybe at this rate, the third part of this exploration of Von Braun and Disney. Okay, so we are... I got off track again. We were talking about Walter Thiel. He had a crater on the moon named after him by his acolytes who gained employment at NASA. That's just a fun fact. His Nazi acolytes, that is, So we were talking about the bombing of Peenemünde. The Allies assessed that the attack would set back weapon production by 6 months, but Dornberger's, quote, on-the-spot estimate, end quote, the next day after the attack was just 6 weeks, and he was correct. Now, from the book Dora by Jean Michel, quote, as in all bombings with a strategically precise objective, the damage caused at Peenemünde was finally less important than one would have thought on inspecting the ruins of the secret base the following day. Work on the V2 was held up for only about 4 to 6 weeks, but Adolf Hitler, who had stayed awake that night until 3:15 a.m., had such a fright that the projects of Dornberger and Wernher von Braun were from then on to control the lives and the deaths of 60,000 of my comrades. Man's murderous frenzy surpasses all imagining when plans excitedly developed for some great ambition must be realized by the efforts of defenseless men. End quote. That last line really hits hard and ties in somewhat well with the next two readings. By the time of the raid on Peenemünde, it had already been the site of successful tests of the A4 rocket, more commonly known as the V2. There is an interesting passage in Crossbow and Overcast about one night after a successful test. Quote, Dornberger had given a small party that night for Dr. Walter Thiel, von Braun, Steinhoff, Hermann Oberth, and a few other members of the staff. They had gotten a little drunk, but there was cause for celebration. The day's test had proved that the long-range missile was a practicable proposition, and since that particular A4 had also been the first object made by man to curve into the borders of outer space, it proved that rocket power was practicable for space exploration. Dornberger had made a short congratulatory speech in which he said, quote within quote, "Today the spaceship is born," end quote within quote. Then he reminded his guests that their first job was to perfect the rocket as a weapon, end quote. And many of those figures at the party were ex-members of the Society for Rocketry, which will come up a little later when we go back in time to discuss Wernher von Braun's pre-war life. Frank noted to me that their utopian ideas, especially Oberth's, rhyme immensely with the themes we will be covering in this little what's going to end up a series within a series, because von Braun and his friendship with Walt Disney, and we are going to be talking about Epcot, Disney's utopian fascist idea, and Disney programming. I'll leave it at that for now, because I really gotta get as much into this episode as possible. Let's pair that passage we just read about the party and Dornberger saying, "Today the spaceship is born," and then reminding them that you're making a weapon. Hey, fuck space, We're trying to kill people. We're gonna pair that with another source I used for today's show, a book by Wayne Biddle titled Dark Side of the Moon, Wernher von Braun, the Third Reich, and the Space Race. Quote, Peenemünde was never a public edifice like Fritz Haber's renowned Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physical Chemistry and Electrochemistry in Berlin, however. It was devoted purely to weapons development and had no civilian function. One of the primary reasons for being located in a remote wilderness was to maintain secrecy about what went on there. In the longer run, its separateness would reinforce the elitist notion that science can somehow be conducted without connection to the society around it, that the scientists and engineers themselves can be untainted by politics. Quote within quote, the army wisely and effectively prevented political interference at Peenemünde by pleading the need for secrecy, end quote within quote, von Braun insisted many years later, though he himself wore a Nazi Party swastika button on his lapel from the beginning. The men who lived to tell about it after 1945, von Braun, Dornberger, and others, insisted self-defensively that space travel was their ultimate dream. And why not? Presented in this utopia with a 4.5-ton rocket 46 feet tall. But there was never a day when their work was not focused on building weapons for the Hitler regime, or when they did not subscribe to policies that were brutally suppressing the free practice of science in Germany. The crown jewel of German R&D from 1937 to 1945 was a Nazi armaments lab, not a center for open exploration." End quote. Von Braun was a proud Nazi, even an SS member. He used the excuses of scientific advancement and space exploration to try defending his past, the death and destruction wrought by his work. To repeat a sentence we recently read, quote, "Man's murderous frenzy surpasses all imagining when plans excitedly developed for some great ambition must be realized by the efforts of defenseless men." End quote. Scientists were generally fascinated by space, and German scientists had a fixation of some sort of fascist space utopia, which fit in just fine with other Nazi beliefs. It is time to explore the Dora concentration camp, where so many slave laborers died in the process of making what you could say were early versions of the rockets von Braun is now renowned for. So, we learned that after the British bombed Peenemünde in their Operation Hydra on August 17 and 18, 1943, V-2 rocket production was moved into the Harz Mountains. Quite literally, the Mittelbau Dora concentration camp was in subterranean tunnels, carved into the mountains. Let's return to reading Dora now, from the chapter with the same title, occasionally skipping some paragraphs. Quote, "The ruins of Peenemünde were still smoldering when, on the 22nd of August 1943 at 11:30 a.m., Himmler arrived at Hitler's HQ in the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia. Diplomatically, the faithful Henry was less surly than usual. He came to offer Speer his help. He proposed, the Minister of Armaments relates, to guarantee secrecy the simplest way. If the entire workforce were concentration camp prisoners, all contact with the outside world would be eliminated. Such prisoners did not even have any mail. He offered to provide all of the necessary technicians from among the prisoners. Unable to offer a more satisfactory arrangement, Speer, the technocrat, was tempted. Having learnt from unhappy experience, Hitler in his turn renounced his dream of missiles made entirely by Germans and ordered that, quote unquote, utilizing to the full manpower which he has available in his concentration camps, every step must be taken to promote both the construction of A4 manufacturing plants and the resumed production of the A4 rocket itself, end quote unquote. Thanks to the bombing of Peenemünde, Himmler's grand design began to take shape. The miraculous missiles would be exclusively built by the SS and their slaves. Though a visionary, Himmler was, as Speer himself admits, a perfectly objective realist, and the man he chose to effect the construction of the rocket factories was an excellently qualified representative of his Black Order. Aged 42, born of respectable bourgeois family, with a distinguished academic record, the Brigade Führer SS Kammler was the director of the SS construction services and, as such, responsible for those architectural marvels of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Majdanek. He was also responsible for the development of an innovation, the gas chamber. As blonde and cold as Reinhard Heydrich, they were both physically and intellectually in the same mold. This former officer of the engineers had served in the Air Ministry. He was, according to Speer, quote unquote, a cold, ruthless schemer, a fanatic in the pursuit of a goal, and as carefully calculating as he was unscrupulous, end quote unquote. This did not prevent Hitler's Minister of Armaments from admitting that, quote unquote, at the time, I rather liked his objective coolness, end quote unquote. An SS officer of that stamp was not the man to waste time. As early as 26th of August, Kammler proposed to Dornberger and Speer. Wernher von Braun does not seem to have been present at this meeting, that they build factories for their missiles at a site as secret as it was romantic, the Harz Massif in the center of Germany. In these deserted valleys near the town of Nordhausen, 70 miles west of Leipzig, an immense network of tunnels and galleries ran through the hills of Kohnstein. For centuries, sodium sulfate had been excavated there. In 1938, Ammoniac, sister company of IG Farben, had taken an interest in it. That same year, a government firm, the WIFO, Company for Economic Research, was ordered to store motor fuel there in preparation for the war. Kammler suggested that the whole place should be enlarged. He would install, in the tunnels, a guaranteed shelter from Allied bombs, assembly lines directed by one of Speer's collaborators, Albin Sawatzky, Henschel Tiger tank production expert. On the 10th of September, from his Wolf's Lair, Adolf Hitler approved the creation of this subterranean complex of factories and decided to give it the name Mittelwerk, or Central Works. We, the deportees from France, Belgium, Holland, Italy, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Russia, Poland, and Germany, were to know these subterranean prisons by another name, the melodious code name chosen by the Nazi concentration camp rulers, Dora. It was barely 11 days since the British had bombed Peenemünde. Hitler had wasted no time in making a decision. The first 100 deportees arrived at Dora on the 23rd of August, 1943, the day after the meeting between Hitler, Himmler, and Speer. From that day onward, the steady stream of convoys from Buchenwald unloaded their human cargo. The 4 other camps, because of the withdrawals of German troops, added theirs. There were no installations in the first tunnel, except for a few scattered tents and a wooden sentry box for the SS guards. The missile slaves worked ceaselessly in fear for their lives, terrorized by the sadistic SS and capos. In the beginning, they drilled, expanded, and fitted out this tunnel almost without tools, with their bare hands. They carried rocks and machines in the most shocking conditions. The weight of the machines was so great that the men, walking skeletons at the end of their strength, were often crushed to death beneath their burden. Ammonia dust burnt their lungs. The food was even insufficient for lesser forms of life. The deportees toiled for 18 hours a day, 12 hours of work, 6 of formalities and controls. They slept in the tunnel. Cavities were hollowed out. 1,024 prisoners in hollows on 4 levels, which stretched for 100 yards. The deportees only saw daylight once a week at the Sunday roll call. The cubicles were permanently occupied, the day team following the night team and then vice versa. Very faint electric bulbs lit this nightmarish scene. There was no drinkable water. You had to make do with any water you could find. For example, where condensation formed. You lapped up liquid and mud as soon as the SS had their backs turned, for it was forbidden to drink undrinkable water. The cold and damp in the tunnel were intense. The water that oozed from the rock caused a disgusting, permanent clamminess. Chilled to the bone, we felt as if our emaciated bodies would go moldy. Some prisoners went mad, others had their nerves shattered as the installation progressed. The constant din was one of the causes. The noise of machines, of pickaxes, the bell of the locomotive, continual explosives, and all of it echoing mercilessly in the closed world of the tunnel. No heat, no ventilation, not the smallest pail to wash in. Death touched us with the cold, the sensation of choking, the filth that impregnated us. And as for the latrines, they were barrels cut in half with planks laid across. They stood at each exit from the rows of sleeping cubicles. It was at Dora that the deportees began to understand the silence of the old men of Buchenwald, their looks of compassion at those who were leaving. They knew, those old men, that you only return from Dora dead, and you return dead to feed the fires of the crematorium. For in the beginning there was no crematorium at Dora. They transported the corpses, and those that were not yet quite corpses, by lorry to Buchenwald. There were commandos for this task who stacked up these things which had once been men, under the orders of SS men with gummies, electric cables encased in rubber, who hurried along the work. Whatever the job, it had to be done quickly. That is the rule in countries which used slave labor. It did not matter that deportees died of ill treatment and exhaustion in the first months of their detention. Others were there to take their place. The SS beat the detainees without mercy. Everything must be sacrificed to achieve the goal. The fate of the Third Reich depended on it. They threw themselves zealously into the role of persecutor, surpassing even themselves in barbarity. End quote. That last bit makes me want to quickly repeat something again. Quote, man's murderous frenzy surpasses all imagining when plans excitedly developed for some great ambition must be realized by the efforts of defenseless men. End quote. The author, Jean-Michel, arrived at Dora on the evening of October 13, 1943, among a convoy of 650 deportees. Over multiple chapters, he further describes the horrible conditions at the camp. After about a month there, he was assigned to be a dentist, and writes of the relative privilege that post provided him compared to other prisoners, such as those who worked with the pickaxes. Due to his position, he was given, quote, the most envied of privileges, sleeping out of the tunnel, end quote. Still, a couple pages later, he includes this haunting part. Quote, I am in the infirmary in Barrack 14, where I sleep. As usual, there is a pile of corpses. As I write these lines, where I want to tell not my own story, but that of all those martyrs at Dora, I wonder how I was able to survive that misery, and why not admit it, get used to the ever-present sight of death. In a few hours the lorry from Buchenwald will come, and these poor men will soon be nothing but calcium dust. On the pile of dead bodies is one which is completely naked. He has been shot in the head. A Russian. He tried to escape. The SS fired at him, stripped him, and threw him there, thinking he was dead. He is brought, with others, to the corpse barracks. As it is full, he is left outside. The following day, just as he is about to be flung into the lorry, that naked man, who has spent the night in a temperature of less than 50 degrees Fahrenheit, sits up. Blood is clotted on his neck, head, and face. At Dora, the inconceivable happened every day. This phantom is carried to the Reverberations. He is operated on in conditions that can only be compared to the early days of surgery, and he recovers. I do not know if he lasted until the end. He may have been executed with the other Russians at the time of the mass hangings of January 1945. On the 3rd of November 1944, almost a year after his resurrection, the day of my arrest in the camp, he was still alive. I saw him. I shook his hand. End quote. I highly recommend reading the entire book. I'm trying to include enough to show how hellish it was at the camp. However, we do have to move ahead to bring Wernher von Braun back into the story. We will excerpt a large amount of the chapter in Dora with his name as its title, then use our other source, Dark Side of the Moon, to learn more about his life. I must note that I am no longer using Crossbow and Overcast, now that we have gotten to discussing the Mittelbau Dora concentration camp and von Braun. You will soon understand why, since the author, James McGovern, is mentioned in the Wernher von Braun chapter of the Dora book. We are going to call this the end of part 1, though, and I'm going to let Frankie and Gina read from Gravity's Rainbow before we end the show, and then we'll do our usual ending stuff, some music, probably some words before that, blah blah blah.
The entrance to the tunnel is shaped like a parabola, the Albert Speer touch. Somebody during the 30s was big on parabolas anyhow, and Albert Speer was in charge of the new German architecture then, and later he went on to become Minister of Munitions and nominal chief customer for the A4 rocket. This parabola here happens to be the inspiration of a Speer disciple named Etzel Osch. He had noticed this parabola shape around on Autobahn overpasses, sports stadiums, und so weiter, and thought it was the most contemporary thing he'd ever seen. Imagine his astonishment on finding that the parabola was also the shape of the path intended for the rocket through space. What he actually said was, "Oh, that's nice." It was his mother who'd named him after Attila the Hun, and nobody'd ever found out why. His parabola had a high loft to it, and the railroad tracks run in underneath, steal into shadows. Battened cloth camouflage furls back at the edges. The mountain goes sloping away above, rock cropping out here and there among the bushes and the trees.
Slother presents his super-duper Shave Pass, signed off by Ike and even more authentic by the colonel heading up the American Special Mission V2 out of Paris, a waxwing specialty of the house. B Company, 47th Armored Infantry, 5th Armored Division appears to be up to something besides security for this place. Slothrop is shrugged on through. There's a lot of moseying, drawling, and country humor around here. Somebody must have been picking his nose. A couple days later, Slothrop will find a dried piece of snot on the card, a crystal-bound visa for Nordhausen.
In past the white-topped guard towers, transformers buzz through the spring morning. Someplace chains rattle and a tailgate drops. Between ruts, high places, ridges of mud are beginning to dry out in the sun, to lighten and crumble. Nearby, the loud wake-up yawn and stretch of a train whistle cuts loose. In past a heap of bright metal spheres in daylight, with a comical sign, "Please, no squeeze the oxygen a unit, eh? How long you swachima this country?"
And under parabola and parable, straight into the mountain, sunlight gone, into the cold, the dark, the long echoes of the Mittelwerke.
There is that not-so-rare personality disorder known as Tannhauserism. Some of us love to be taken under mountains, and not always with horny expectations. Venus, Frau Olda, her sexual delights. No, many come actually for the gnomes, the critters smaller than you, for the sepulchral way time stretches along your hooded strolls down here, quietly through courtyards that go on for miles, with no anxiety about getting lost. No one stares. No one is waiting to judge you, out of the public eye.
Even a minnesinger needs to be alone. Long, cloudy day indoor walks. The comfort of a closed place, where everyone is in complete agreement about death.
Slothrop knows this place, not so much from maps he had to study at the casino, as knowing it in the way you know someone is there. Plant generators are still supplying power. Rarely a bare bulb will hollow out a region of light. As darkness is mined and transported from place to place like marble, so the light bulb is the chisel that delivers it from its inertia, and has become one of the great secret icons of the humility, the multitudes who were passed over by God and by history.
When the Dora prisoners went on their rampage, the light bulbs in the rocket works were the first to go. Before food, before the delights to be looted out of the medical lockers, and a hospital pharmacy in stolen number 1, these breakable, socketless. In Germany, the word for electric socket is also the word for mother, so motherless too. Images were what the liberated had to take.
The basic layout of the plant is another inspiration of Etzel-Olsch, a Nazi inspiration just like the parabola, but also again a symbol belonging to the rocket. Picture the letters SS, each stretched lengthwise a bit. These are the two main tunnels, driven well over a mile into the mountain. Or picture a ladder with a slight S-shaped ripple in it, lying flat. 44 rung-like Stollen or cross tunnels, linking the two main ones. A couple 100 feet of rock mountain at the deepest, pressed down overhead.